Kia ora everyone. We'll get started. So welcome to your first breakout session today, Building Inclusive Systems Through Understanding Diverse Realities. It's my pleasure to introduce your presenter for this session, Tyler Ngātai. Tyler is the practice lead at Arotaiohi, the peak body for youth development in Aotearoa. In his mahi, Tyler collaborates with stakeholders nationwide to challenge existing policies and create equitable systems and environments for young people and their supporters. The focus of these sessions, and for the sessions of the rest of the day, is around bridging the gap, taking the information that we've got about different generations throughout the last few days, and thinking about how we can use that information to bridge the gap. So this session will highlight how both young people and adults have distinctive contributions to make, and how valuing different perspectives, multiple perspectives from different generations, helps us move beyond assumptions and create systems that benefit everyone. So welcome, Tyler.
E harataku maunga I te maunga neke neke a maunga tūtonu a maunga hukurangi. He mokopuna ahau no te tai rāwhiti, no te ure o tūwhaka iri ora no Ngāti Parau ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. That's me. We've got this standard brand guideline that requires you to put your picture up. I used to have one where I was jumping in the air and then got told that, you know, in order to be serious, you have to have a serious photo. And so, look at that. So it's the first time using it. I am the practice leader at Arotaiohi, the peak body for youth development. I also am a senior consultant at Leadership Lab, which is it's a group of friends really that does some work together, and we have a great time. But this isn't about me, so I'm going to quickly move on to the next slide. Just like every session that we have at Arotaiohi, it's really important to get to know who's who in the zoo, and open with a bit of whanaungatanga. We won't have time to go around this whole rōpū, but I think it's really important to initially connect with one another. There may be somebody at your table that you may not have introduced yourself to, or you may not know the person sitting next to you. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, but before we get into that, I want you to introduce yourself, whether it's in a peer or at your table. And I've been told as well that you've been doing a lot of reflecting around when you were 16. For some of us, it was a wee while ago, and then some of us, it was literally yesterday, like myself. But I want you to go back to a time when you were 16. And the two questions up there was who was important to you at the age of 16, and what was important to you when you were 16. So I'll give you a couple of minutes at your tables, introduce yourself, maybe your orgs, who you are, and then share at your table who and what was important to you at the age of 16. Ka pai? Awesome. Ka pai. Feels a bit uncomfortable sitting behind a lectern as if I'm, so I'm going to get a bit closer with you guys and share the space. I'm intrigued to know, and we can popcorn this and you can just, yell out, but at the age of 16, who was important to you? Friends. Whānau? Food? Yeah. Yeah, teachers. You spent a lot of time at kura in schools, and so, teachers, youth workers, sometimes if you're in church, it's your pastor as well, yeah? Ka pai. See any other ones? What was that? Aroha mai. Coaches, absolutely. Sports coaches. So with acknowledging who was important, what are some of the things what were some of the things in your world when you were 16 that was important to you? Music? Sport? School? Yeah? No? What else? What about relationship-wise? So, like at the age of 16, you're normally, figuring out girlfriends, boyfriends, friends in general, parties. Hey, we all love to a sneaky party at your mate's place when your parents were away. Yeah. Perfect. So licensing, independence. In order to gain independence, what fuels that? You've got to earn the money. So what do you have to do to get that money? Yeah, you've got to have a mahi, eh? You've got to work. That's creating that life, yeah? The reason why I ask these two questions is, I might turn this on. We often talk about how different things are with young people today. Living in a digital world with technology, social media, the pace of change. But how do we actually slow down and actively listen to young people today, knowing full well that they are in this phase of 16? I think the other thing that as well in realisation is that some things haven't changed that much. So when I asked you who was important to you, you'd said friends, whānau, parents, grandparents. 16-year-olds or young people today are actively identifying those same things across the motu, across the country. When we look at what was important to you at the age of 16, young people today are also identifying sports, school, independence, the licensing stuff, work, got to have the money. All of those things are still very prominent today as to what they were when you were 16 too. And so today we're actually going to explore a little bit about, acknowledging that there's this gap, but we're actually all starting from the same point. So the experiences you have had at the age of 16 may be different in course, but you're essentially in that same space and you're actually experiencing something very, very similar, but the context is different. Young people today are navigating their own versions of those challenges, but within a more complex and connected world. Their language might be different, their platforms might be different, more digital. I think about myself when I was 16, I think Bebo was around. I think it was one of the first ones, Yeah, but in MySpace, MSN, can you give me your love? Where now, you've got Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. My nephew, who's 16, said, Facebook, no one uses that anymore. And then YouTube has regained a real good, more of a relevance in today's world than what it was when I was growing up. But at the core, the desire to be seen, valued, and understood, that's all the same. When you were 16 versus today, what we have also experienced now is what matters, and is also similar, and it may not necessarily be the same, but the context is. We acknowledge that we've stood in similar places, we create room for connection and the opportunity to build relationships, and that is the drawing of the experiences. It's not about saying, I know exactly what you're going through, but rather, I recognise parts of your experiences because I've carried some of those same feelings too. I might just repeat that because I know exactly what you're going through. How many people have heard that before? Yeah. How many of us have actually said it, eh? Versus, I recognise parts of your experience because I've carried some of those same feelings too. May not necessarily be, word for word, but there are some similar feelings in those experiences. This is where intergenerational connection becomes powerful, when we recognise that our experiences aren't as far apart as they seem. It opens the door to deeper conversations and mutual reciprocal learning. And so the previous speaker there talked about that reciprocal component of learning. We can move from speaking for young people to walking alongside them, sharing power, sharing stories, and shaping systems together. And so what we're going to do today is actually have a look at some of those systems and that huge hype word of systems change that's become more relevant than others. Cumulative identities and inclusive systems. Whilst I'm talking and sharing some of this information with you, I want you to think about a part of your identity that has shaped how you show up in your work, but also what parts of your identity get centred or silenced in systems that you're either engaging with or that are impacting you. So, young people and adults hold multiple intersecting identities. These identities shape how we experience systems, barriers, and opportunities, right? The closer to, and this is a model of, a framework that Kath Harrison and I had put together and put it, you may have heard of the power wheel. This one here we kind of did an edition of what that looks like in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and identifying some of the systems that are unique to our whenua here. So the closer to the centre of the wheel, the more power and privilege each identity maker tends to hold within our dominant systems. The closer to the edge of the wheel, our systems tend to create more marginalisation and exclusion. Any given person's cumulative experience will be impacted by multiple identity markers and the significance of those markers to systems of power. And so I talked about systems change and who's heard of the term, and is more prominent today, that term, than what it was 5 to 10 years ago. And so systems change refers to the comprehensive transformation of interconnected structures. Not just structures, but policies and processes within societies or organisations to address underlying issue and achieve sustainable outcomes. It's a real politician description, eh? These systems encompass various dimensions such as economic, social, political, and cultural, and often operate in complex, independent ways. Examples of systems include healthcare systems, education, criminal justice, and economic. Each of these systems involve a network of people, rules, norms, and resources that shape individual experiences and outcomes within our society. So when having a look at this wheel, multiple aspects of marginalisations intersect with systems. They can intensify the challenges faced by certain groups, leading to what can be referred to as double discrimination. For instance, within the healthcare system, individuals from already marginalised communities such as Māori, Pacifica and or LGBTQIA may encounter additional barriers to accessing quality care due to the other intersecting factors such as socio-economic status or ability. Similarly, in the education system, akonga who are marginalised due to both their age and neurodiversity, for example, may face systemic barriers over and above those faced by their peers, hindering their academic achievement and limiting their opportunities for advancement. Addressing systems change requires a holistic approach that acknowledges and confronts the root causes of inequality and injustice. So this entails not only reforming specific policies and practices, but it also challenging underlying power dynamics and ideological frameworks that perpetuate systemic marginalisation. By fostering inclusive decision-making processes and centering the voices and experience of marginalised communities, systems change efforts can promote greater equity, justice and resilience within society. So ultimately, embracing this complexity helps organisations like yours and mine design more equitable responses to community and environments. So we're all about creating the environment itself for people who engage and experience marginalisation to not. I hope that wasn't a mic drop moment there, but. So, take a minute, process, but also at your tables, either within your peers, I want you to share about the one part of your identity that has shaped how you show up in your work, but what parts of your identity get centred or silenced in the systems that you're engaging with as well. And I'll give you a couple of minutes for that. Kia ora te whānau. Is anyone feeling brave enough to have a bit of a share? You don't have to, we can move on. Is there anything that stood out for you when answering these questions? Are you wiping your nose, or was that your hand up? Kia ora. Oh, yeah, no. Yeah. The further conversations around this as well is when, we go to work, something might happen and we follow a certain process. And what we don't necessarily think about is where we actually position ourselves if we're in charge of that process. Where do we stand is really important in order to gain a full understanding of the impacts of that process. A few of us in Christchurch have put a lot of work into unpacking this within community. What we see is the diversity in those groups is astronomical because of the marginalised experiences that they're having within, their spaces and their environments. Relating this back to young people though, if you were to have a look at this where you were at 16, majority of the time you sit in that wider circle, right? So that's a bit of food for thought. Is there any other partai? Kei te pai whaia, tuatahi e mihi ana kia koe. The other thing is as well, and on that, is the system itself. The system of Te Matatini and its creation back in the 80s and the way it operated and worked is completely different to what it is now. And so how has that improved to then be able to enable and create participation? Which is a good lead-in into this next phase of understanding whaiwahitanga. So we use this wheel when talking about intersectionality. And I don't want to turn this into a mana taiohi training. That's another kaupapa. But what I do have is I have some resources to give out, or to win, let's make it a competition, around mana taiohi. And so we talk about whaiwahitanga, and whai essentially meaning to seek or chase or seek and find. Wahi, space or place. And so when we have a look at whaiwahi, we use the kupu chasing their place. And so when we look at mana taiohi, which is the National Youth Development Principles, whaiwahitanga talks about young people finding their place, and that's one of the principles of mana taiohi. Whaiwahitanga in many contexts can be from, what are they called? YAGs, Youth Advisory Groups. And they're a system set up for young people to be heard in a particular realm. For many Māori, whaiwahitanga looks like helping your cousin choosing to help your cousin at the marae do the dishes. And so the scope of this is purely in the eye of the beholder. But we've heard many examples as to how you set up a system or a process for young people to engage. And I think the way in which we analyse whaiwahitanga is not limited to a specific process. You know, we recently had Youth Parliament here in Poneke, and that was all over the news. It was great. Some great publicity for young people. But for the ministry, that's their focus, and that's what they call whaiwahitanga. But it's their system. And so my pātai to you is, in your mahi or in your work, is youth voice shaping change, and where is it still missing? And it's really easy for us to say, oh, we'll get a group of young people, they can tell us what, and then we'll go in there. But actually, what does it look like for us to scaffold, and when they fall, we pick them up? But also, that reciprocal nature of learning requires us to kind of be there, not necessarily be in full decision mode, but support them in that decision-making process. Because that part there as practitioner or as a person assisting in that process is just as important as what it is for young people to also be able to show up. And so neither one takes priority. Whaiwahitanga has to work collectively. So my pātai to you, and I'll give you another couple of minutes, is where in your work is youth voice shaping change, and where is it still missing? Ka pai? Cool. Just as you finish talking with your group, you know, within our mahi, there's an element of, I guess, control, eh? And no matter what we're doing in terms of our work, there's some form of power within the organisational structure or whatever realm we're kind of working in. So when discussing the concept of power and how it manifests, there's also that element of power of belonging versus the power of control, and drawing on different cultural perspectives and approaches to power. And so when we're having a look at whaiwahitanga, what does it look like to create the environment of belonging versus the environment of control? And what I wanted to share was the intergenerational learning as system disruption. I think sometimes people acknowledge that the intergenerational element is the disruption versus the system itself is creating that tension. And so we have to navigate the balance between what is and isn't working when working with young people. So whai wāhitanga talks about real contribution, not tokenism. And I think that's one thing I would really push for a takeaway today is to acknowledge that. I've got some notes, but I'm just going to talk to it. I think that's a lot easier. And so when we think about the spaces that we're creating and the mutual reciprocal learning when working with young people, we've come from a time where we were the expert. Hey, we are recruited to do something, therefore we hold that mātauranga, we hold that knowledge. What I say goes, you listen to me. That's very much this left-hand side. There's an element of control. There's a hierarchical status. And I'm seen to be upheld by other people below me. And so when we look at bridging the generational gap with young people, it's also our responsibility, and I want you to now look at the right-hand side, it's our responsibility to uphold them, but it's collective, it's not hierarchical. We're not controlling a process, we're essentially creating a space and an environment for belonging. And the difference between this is that we're flipping this left-hand side upside down, and collectively we're progressing and we're moving forward together. And so this model here also highlights, on your left you have a westernized ideology of power, the monarchy. We have a prime minister. Under the prime minister, they have, this is all westernized systems that have been embedded in our society. Versus when you have a look over to our right, this is the model of power that you see in a lot of Indigenous practices. Not just Māori, there's, cousins of Te Whenua Moemoeā in Australia. It's all about collective well-being. The islands, the Pacific Islands, also hold people. I heard in the kōrero previously around leadership through service. And what does that actually look like? To be out working, but for what? The better good of all. And so the differences, and when we have a look at being able to outwork whai wāhitanga, but also draw that generational gap, how do we uphold not only young people, but our mates standing next beside us as well? For the collective, not necessarily to make me look good and then I'm going to leave you there and go over here by myself. And so when we have a look at this hierarchical approach, it's very individualistic. Hey, it's about me, not necessarily we. Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't say necessarily control, but what I would say is that in terms of accountability, a lot of the systems and how we are set up as a nation, but also as a community, there's an accountable piece there. But what would that look like to shift our thinking to be held accountable collectively versus individually? And what would it look like to go through things like restorative process where it's a win-win, not a win-lose? And so I in particularly think of some of our systems here when we identify a process, and I'm in particularly thinking of HR processes. Not that I've been involved in any, okay, I'm just going to stipulate that too. But normally in those processes, there's a win-lose mentality, but also a system that's set up for someone to win and someone to lose. And I particularly think of our justice system as well, which is the left-hand side too. Yeah. 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 Yep. 100%. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. What I will say is that when we get that balance, and I use that figure of 8 around balancing the tension and what it looks like to sit in the middle, not necessarily in either or, and how we can, have that equal balance between two. But one thing I would state is, in particularly with young people and in a community setting, on our right-hand side, that model of practice and that collective mentality serves better purpose than what it does on our left. Yeah, yeah. Around the wheel and identifying the privilege that you have versus where this model, and it's almost overlapping, yeah? And it's essentially using both to gain a better understanding of how we lead as community leaders. I think one thing that I've experienced is young people care about similar things. The environment is quite prominent within the culture of young people today. Civic engagement, education. So within that, there's total spaces, and I in particularly think of Youth Parliament, which is ran off that model, where behind that person that may look or come from that model, there's a whole lot of young people behind it too. Kia ora. And I think of my sister when you talk like that, Whaia, around, she held it down for us growing up, hey? And she held out, her younger siblings and what that looks like. Also as reference to the creation of feeling safe and feeling like we belong somewhere, eh? Yeah, kia ora. We'll see what we can rustle out. I've just been given the 5, is that 5? Alrighty. So, this is real hybrid, and so I'm sorry if I've rushed through. And I will send through the link to the article that references this within Youth Work as well. Just before I ask that top question, acknowledge identities are cumulative, and so is transformation. Hey, transformation is never just that final destination, because we're forever evolving. just like from Bebo to Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat to, all these new additions. Challenge. Challenge systems. Systems won't shift unless we shift how we see and relate to one another. So remember the very first activity that we did around understanding that our experiences of 16, or who and what we find is important at that age, is still very current today. It's just the environments and the context that is different. Commit. So take action grounded in mana taiuhi and intersectional practice. And so understanding what intersectionality is, it's not just having a whole lot of different identities, there's also a systems element to that. So with intersectionality, you have cumulative identities, but there's also an influence of systems and how those identities are shown in those systems as well. So my last question for today, what one action will you take to centre real youth voice and identity in your spaces? And so I'll give you a minute and then I'll open up if anyone else wants to share. Ka pai hoki mai e te whānau. The resources that we've handed out today, one of them is, I'm not taking it, you get to keep it. This one here is the Youth Work Journal, Kai Parahuarahi, which is centred around mana taiuhi. So there's a whole lot of different articles from people who work with children and young people and how they outwork that. And so whaiwahitanga in this journal looks, there's a whole lot of different youth participation models of practice in here. These are all accessible online for free as well. And so feel free to look at arataiuhi.org.nz. That was a bit of a plug, to have a look at those resources online. The other one that I've given out is the mosaic cards. And so it's around creating cohesion through conversation. Something that you can do as a team or even with young people. But this resource was formed in response to the mosque attacks in Christchurch around how can we have conversations with young people around some of those pressing elements of white supremacy, discrimination, everything. I won't go in too much, but it's a card set that helps navigate mapping ideas from young people, to unpack that and then to weave cohesion through conversation, and so that's also available online as well. Plugs over. Would anyone like to share the one action that you will take to centre real youth voice and identity in your space? Note I'm holding the very last pack of cards. Yeah, there we go. Kia ora. I'll make the long walk across. Well done. Kia ora. Thank you. Kia ora. That's me for today. But I guess that was the first time I've actually specifically spoke about this as well. So if you do have any questions, please come up and give you my contact details and we can continue. Or I'll send through some of the links where this stuff sits for us in terms of reading and that as well. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ngā mihi, Tyler. Great session, I think. Lots to think about and take back to our mahi as we return from this conference later in the week. Love the concept of scaffolding to support young people, to let them to show up and lead the way, and that concept of a win-win, not a win-lose, taking that perspective. So thank you very much for your time today. We now head into lunch, everyone. So again, lunch out in the foyer area there, and then after lunch we'll be heading straight into our next session. So just make your way to whatever room that is in. Thanks everyone.